But there's another mode of thinking about those divergent views as, so there's one whole area of research called construction of preference, and within that, holding competing preferences is seen as a completely feasible, conscious, agental kind of thing to do. And actually my colleague Nick Pigeon has also, in his past work on trust, has argued that there is a form of what he calls critical trust, wherein where they call healthy skepticism allies with practical reliance on a person or an institution. In other words, you need that person or an institution, and just because you act as if you need them, it doesn't mean that you fully, wholly agree with them, and that obviously and in that case they argue it isn't a paradox to have a contradiction between actions implying trust and stated opinions of lack of trust. And of course there are all kinds of methodological issues about this, because if the surveys are eliciting statements about lack of trust, but people are behaving in a more trusting way, that does create some problems. And in fact, survey research has tended to report more techno-enthusiasm, and qualitative work like the Deepen project have reported more ambivalence. And our work is actually somewhere in between, meaning that we actually find evidence of uncertainty and ambivalence in this dialogic survey work. A dialogic meaning that we are in those survey instruments going back and forth and trying to trace the emergence of views by providing a number of different steps along the formation of those views. And then we've also found in our deliberative work considerable enthusiasm, even in the UK where we weren't really looking for it, depending on the applications. And so essentially what I'm arguing here is that in the case of these US deliberation participants, that looking at ambivalence and uncertainty in particular seems to be exactly the place for mapping these contingent emergent views onto a number of axes of interpretation, and it seems to be precisely the point where trying to understand how gender and race ethnicity, for example, are produced in that context, and also arguably where cultural narrative is produced. It's precisely at those points of ambivalence where you most see that happening. And so I guess the bottom line here is that I'm arguing that holding these strong negative and positive views and uncertainty, which I would say is a different thing from ambivalence itself, that is indeed the core of the social process, not a stage in a linear evolution, and therefore that is actually in this work precisely the place to go for understanding views about power and vulnerability, trust and distrust, strength and weakness, and attitudes towards environment and health. And so I have some narrative. I don't know whether you want to do that or whether I've thrown out enough here that. Okay. So I'll close there.
So, open to questions, and should we go back to some of the data which we were.
We can do that.
If you want to look at any slides that came before, we can go to them. Yeah, John?
I was interested in the beginning of the talk how you talk about a lot of the sponsors of this research are interested in engineering opinion, whereas you're more, very clearly stated, more interested in cataloging rather than changing what exists out there. And I was curious though, especially in the conversation about distrust of corporate entities, distrust of sort of the corporation, the idea that the corporation is funding an initiative to try to change opinion on the one hand about a risk, that's very clearly sort of an intention trying to meet this distrust that you're saying readily exists of the corporation. I was curious as to what are, if we could get maybe a little bit more detail as to what are the risks that the corporation is aware of that nanotechnology sort of offers, that they're maybe trying to brush with. If that makes sense.
Okay, so that's actually a good question in multiple ways. So, and there's several ways of answering it.
Sure.
So, and one, I haven't talked at all, we're actually doing a whole series of expert studies because this is so upstream. Actually, some of the key stakeholders in this whole activity are different kinds of experts who are engaged in this, and we're doing a lot of work on that. And so, one of the problems is with this, when you get into risk perception, is that the people who are close to things tend to attenuate their risks. So they tend to have lower risk perception in many cases than they ought to. And so you have other processes going on. So it isn't just that they know things that they're putting, under the rug. It's that so our industry survey that we're just starting to draft the first paper out of shows that industry has a lower sense of risk. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they know there are risks that they're hiding. It's because they also are subject to the same sets of processes. And in fact, I interviewed a lot of nanoscience folks on this campus when I got started, trying to understand how they thought about this work that they were doing, and pretty much they all said, well, what I'm doing here is fine. This is safe because we're doing this, and this, but if you go to those labs over there, those people, we are working, everything we work with is in solution. This is totally safe, but those dry powder people, oh man, you should go over there. You go over and talk to the dry powder people, and they say, oh, well, this is totally controlled, we're using all the personal protective equipment we should, and these materials are extremely well understood, but man, what we're really, those people who are working with biologics, those are the ones in solution, you really should go look at them. So they perceive the domain more broadly to be filled with danger, but they don't perceive that their own lab particularly holds harm. So that's one answer, is that I don't think you should necessarily think about it as intentional manipulation or obfuscation.
Sure.
On the other hand, industry absolutely has concern, and so one of the things, and rising concern, and the survey we did in 2006, industry actually was saying they wanted guidance from government, which is quite unusual. And that's probably for liability reasons. They would love to deflect liability concerns onto the federal government or the international regulatory regimes that are doing this. But there's also, let's see, I wanted to. So in terms of perceptions, I mean, the idea that companies, the public absolutely think that, or at least the views we elicited in these workshops are that industry has already solved all these problems. They know how to make all this. So in the midst of all this debate, there's almost no skepticism about the claims of what science can actually do. There's total belief in that whole part of the enterprise in a way that's just astounding. So you could make the most far-out claims, and they were not differentiated at all from everyday technology that's here and now. And so they think, I think there's actually a